As Heather mentioned, my name is Josh Hickman, and today I'm going to be talking about Android malware, but probably not in the way that we normally think about it. But before I get started, I do want to tell you a little bit about me, and you can see my title there. Currently, I'm a senior vice president in the cyber risk practice at Kroll. I'm coming up on my 3-year anniversary at Kroll, and before that, I was the manager of the digital evidence section in the State Crime Lab, North Carolina. And prior to that, I was in law enforcement for 16 years. Most of that was at the state level, dealing mainly with violent crime and public corruption. But towards the end of my career, I made my way over to the computer crime section, which put me on the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force and introduced me to this whole digital forensics thing. Occasionally, I do blog, and periodically, I release data sets to the public. Those normally coincide with major releases of Android and iOS. Side note, you can probably expect to see one coming up. Android 13 was released a couple of hours ago. When I'm not doing all that, I do like to run. I know a lot of people in the digital forensics community are run averse, but I do like to run as my release. So before we get to talking about the malware, I want to talk about why I felt like this was an important talk. And I'm going to start on the desktop side of the house. Back in June, Microsoft released a report in which they described their investigation into an organization that was leveraging several 0 days to target and exploit Windows hosts. It was the Knotweed report for those of you that may have read it. And in that report, they used a phrase that has been around now for just about a year, private sector offensive actor. And for those of you that may not necessarily be familiar with that term, that describes an organization that through whatever means, they identify 0 days in various platforms. And instead of going through the mechanism for responsible reporting, they take those exploits, they package them up as a service, and then they market that service to interested parties. Now, the fact that these organizations exist and there's a market for this particular service just brings to light the problem. We are all walking around with lucrative targets in our back pockets. And that is because the information that is contained on our phones can be very valuable to interested parties. These organizations understand this. Malicious actors also understand this, and they're trying very hard to get on our devices to commit on-device fraud, to steal our information, whether it be credentials, contact information, communications, what have you. Now, I'm from North Carolina, not necessarily deep south, but I feel like I am allowed to say this. Google, bless their hearts, they try very hard to keep malware out of the Play Store, but they still struggle, and that results in headlines that look like this. And these are not small, these are all articles from the past month. These are not small numbers that we're seeing, right? 100,000 plus, 1 million downloads, 3 million downloads. Relatively speaking, probably a very small fraction of the overall Android install base, but this is still a lot of potential victims. And as mobile device examiners, we need to just go ahead and come to the realization that it's no longer a matter of if we're going to run across malware on a mobile device. It's now a matter of when. So considering all that, what I wanted to do is take a look at malware on Android from two perspectives. The first being the perspective of an examiner, right? As examiners, we normally think of malware on Android, hey, I need to pull this APK off, pull the Android manifest file out, look at what permissions are there, and possibly reverse engineer some of this code. That's great, but you may not necessarily be able to reverse engineer code all the time. You may not have the skills needed to do it, and that's fine. You may not have time to do it, whether you're, criminal justice examiner and you have a very large backlog, or if you're in consultancy and you just don't have budget built out for reverse engineering code. Regardless, reverse engineering may not necessarily always be an option for you. The second perspective is that of a user. A user is going to have a lot of good information for you as far as unexplained or odd behavior on a device, but that person may not be available to you all the time. They may be an opposing party in some type of legal proceeding, or they may have the ultimate unavailability. They may be deceased. For those of you that work in law enforcement, how many times have you had a deceased individual's phone brought to you and the investigator says, hey, just find me all the things, right? That happens all the time. So in order to look at it from both perspectives, I took a page out of the security researcher's playbook and I set up a Honeyphone. Now this is just a honeypot, but I thought, hey, security researchers do this all the time on the desktop side. Why can't we do this on the mobile? And when I started this process, my intention was to have a physical phone available, live on it for a while, generate a lot of test data, and then just infect it with malware and let the malware run rampant. And what I found as I got into this was the current trend in mobile and malware on Android really involves banking Trojans and on-device fraud. But I wanted to look at a different piece of malware that had a different objective other than just fraud. And I was able to accomplish this, as we'll see. Now, if you've used any of my public data sets, you know that there is a particular account that you will always see. I'm not quite ready to burn that account just yet. So for this exercise, I have 2 new accounts, one on each phone, and each phone had its own separate set of third-party applications, all of that with test data in it. And to make these devices a little bit more attractive to potential attackers, I did put some financial apps on there. However, there are no accounts associated with these financial apps, and that's just because the government frowns upon using false identities to open up financial accounts. But one of these phones did have some crypto on it. I used an app called Ledger. It uses a cold storage wallet and had some Bitcoin, Ethereum, and some Dogecoin all on one particular phone. Now, these phones are Pixel 3s. They are able to run the most up-to-date version of Android at the time when I started this, which was Android 12, and it was running the latest security patch at the time. The first phone belongs to Mr. Thomas DFIR, or DFIR, depending on how you want to pronounce it. I lived on his phone for approximately a month and a half, and that phone ran in an unrooted state for the entire time up until the very last second when I rooted it so I could get a full file system. His phone had 3 malware samples on it. The first is T-bot, and in the parentheses below, that is the APK name for that particular piece. T-bot was caught earlier this year in the Google Play Store. That is a legitimate QR code and barcode scanner. It functions, but this is a dropper. What would happen is when a user would open this app at first runtime, it would download an add-on, and that was the malicious payload that came to the phone. It is a banking Trojan, so it has all the typical features. It can screenshot, read your messages. It can grant itself additional permissions if needed, and there is a remote access capability to it should a human operator decide to hop on your device. The second malware sample is Sharkbot. Again, another banking Trojan, very similar to T-bot. Also in the Play Store earlier this year, this is another dropper. Unlike T-bot, what would happen is when this was installed, it would silently download the malicious payload in the background. The user would never be aware that this app did this in the background with no intervention on their part. In addition to the same capabilities as T-bot, this also has a key logging function, and it has the ability to perform injection attacks or overlay attacks. So you would have an app that was open with a screen. Sharkbot would overlay its screen on top of it. You punch in your credentials and boom, Sharkbot has your creds. It would send off to a C2 somewhere. Third variant is Escobar. And again, you can see the APK name in the parentheses. I wrote about this earlier this year. It is not necessarily a banking Trojan, but it does have banking Trojan-like capabilities. But in addition to those, it's also able to grab your location and record video and audio, again, without your knowledge. And there is also the ability to use a VNC module to allow an attacker to hop on your device. The GIF on the right shows me granting Escobar access to the accessibility services. And as you can see, as soon as I click that switch, it grants itself all of these permissions in rapid succession so fast I can't even get it on video. And then as a defensive mechanism, what happened was Android tried to turn Play Protect back on. I had turned it off to make sure that the malware is successfully installed. And it tried to turn itself on a couple times, and then I caught it. And as you can see, Escobar ejected itself out of the most recently used apps tray. The second phone belongs to Elizabeth Denner, Liz. If there are any Star Trek fans out there, you'll recognize that name. She is a character from the original series. I lived on her phone for about 3.5 weeks, and she had 2 samples on her phone, and she was rooted the entire time that I was running this exercise. The first piece of malware is Mollybot. Mollybot is a relatively new banking Trojan. As you can see, the APK name in the parentheses. This has the ability to masquerade as different types of apps, but in this particular samples case, it tried to be Chrome. As you can see, I exposed the notification or the recently used apps tray. You can see there is Mollybot, and then the actual Chrome was next to it. And the interesting thing about Mollybot is anytime I opened any third-party application or certain native Android applications, it would present me with this Google login screen. And it got to the point where the phone was barely usable, but it ended up malfunctioning at some point, and this went away, which was kind of nice. The last piece of malware is Hermit. Now, Hermit has been associated by both Lookout and Google as being associated with RCS Lab. So again, one of those private sector offensive actors. Very interesting backstory. I'm not going to get into it. I would highly recommend reading the Google and Lookout reports on this particular variant. But as you can see in the GIF on the left, it needs a bunch of permissions to operate. But the interesting thing is that once you get past this screen, it opens legitimate Samsung pages. It was masquerading as Samsung helper, but there are other variants that masquerade as like Facebook support, WhatsApp support, the various Meta products. So I have 2 phones, both are infected with malware. Where do I start? And the answer to that question is the usual digital forensics answer. It depends, right? It depends on what you know about that phone, the intel that you've got, either by way of the user or if an investigator has brought this phone to you and can relay that to you, or it can be personal preference. In this case, I went with personal preference, and I would like to see what apps are currently on the phone, but have historically been on that phone as well. And there are 3 particular files that you can use to see that. The first is local app state.db, frosting.db, and packages.xml. And the reason I have all 3 of these files on one slide is to get the best overall view of all these apps is to look at these files collectively. They have to be examined together in order to get the best picture. This is local app state B from Tom's phone. As you can see, there's some nice columns in here: package name, first download, the Google account that's associated with the app, and then the name or the friendly name all the way there on the right. Now, I tried to filter the package column by Escobar. That was the easiest term for me to remember because it wasn't gibberish. And as you can see at the bottom, I came up with nothing. In fact, none of the malware samples appeared in local app state.db. And that's because local app state.db is designed to keep tabs on apps that are coming from the Google Play Store. To get a view of what apps are side-loaded, not coming from the Play Store, you need to go to frosting.db. And this is here, I've got the malware samples highlighted. Each one of these malware samples were side-loaded. They were pushed to the phones rather by ADB, and then I used Google Files to install the apps. So now I have some apps, didn't come from the Google Play Store, but they're here. Where did they come from? Well, that's where packages.xml comes into play. Again, this is from Tom's phone. In the red, I have the package name highlighted, that's Escobar, but the key area here is the area in blue. There's a tag value in there called installer equals, and it ends with mbu.files. That is the APK name for the Google Files app. That makes sense because I use Google Files to install all the malware. If an app comes to Android by way of the Google Play Store, that value will be com.android.vending. That is the APK name for the Play Store. Now you will find apps in this file that have no installer value. It just won't be there, and that's fine. These are typically apps that are associated with Android, and you can, breeze on past those. They're not that big of a deal. ALEAP will parse all three of these files for you. This is, again, from Tom's phone. This is the packages.xml report. And I've got it filtered by apps that were installed by Google Files. And you can see in the blue, that's Google Files. In the red, those are my malware samples. And again, ALEAP can parse all three of those files for you. Now I'm going to switch gears for a second and talk about battery. And I want to bring up something that I know appears sometimes in SANS instructional materials, and that's the malware paradox. Malware can hide, but it must run. And on a phone, it's going to need resources to do that, right? It needs access to the CPU, needs access to memory, and those things in turn are going to need access to the battery. Now, Android 12 has a new thing called battery usage. I'm not going to get into that, mainly because, again, that's fairly new. I will direct you to an article that Kevin Pagano wrote about battery usage. But just know battery usage is an option if it's Android 12 or 13, and ALEAP can parse it for you. But what about all these other devices that are not running Android 12? And as it turns out, there is a utility that Google offers that can help us answer these questions with regards to battery usage, and it's called Battery Historian. Now, Battery Historian is designed by Google to let app developers troubleshoot their apps if there is a situation where their app is draining, a lot of battery. But we can use it for this particular purpose. Battery Historian runs in a Docker container. I'm not going to get into the setup process. Just know that where you download Battery Historian from, there's an excellent set of instructions that will walk you through that process. It will have you up and running in about 5 minutes. Now, Battery Historian needs two things to operate: battery stats.txt and a bug report from the phone. And there's two ways to get a hold of those things. The first, and in my opinion, the easiest way to do that is to use Android Triage, which is a tool that Mattia Epifani offers. It's freely available. You can run out to his GitHub repo and pull it down. Choosing option one will generate those two things for you and deposit it onto your workstation in a nice folder. The other option is to use ADB on the command line. I know a lot of people tend to shy away from command line and ADB in general, but if you're comfortable with it and that is an option for you, knock yourself out. But again, Android Triage is the best way to tackle it, no fuss. Now, once you get those two things and you get it imported into Battery Historian, this is what it's going to look like. This is from Tom's phone, and I will draw your attention to that line that goes, there's a decline, a sharp incline, and then another decline. That is actually the battery discharging over a 48-hour period. The phone discharged over 24 hours. I charged it, and then it discharged yet again. This is highly unusual for Tom's phone because that phone has been an absolute workhorse for me for the past 3 years, and it was easily able to go 2.5, 3 days without a charge. So this is unusual for this particular phone. Now, I'll draw your attention to that area down in the bottom left. That is the area where you can sort apps by different metrics. So in this case, since we're talking about battery usage, I'm going to sort all the apps on this phone by battery usage and see how they all look as compared to each other. And when I do that, you can see Escobar is all the way at the top. Now, remember, this is a 48-hour, this is about 48 hours worth of data. And in a 48-hour period, it's using just under 58% of the total battery power, which is huge because I can't even interact with this particular app. Anytime I tried to open this app, it would immediately eject me out of the screen and then lock the phone. So I have no interaction with this app, but yet it's using a lot of battery power. The second red box there in the middle, that is T-Bot. And again, another app I can't interact with. And then pulling up the rear is SharkBot. yet another app that I cannot interact with. So, battery usage is big. This is the best way to take a look at it. But what about CPU usage? Well, Battery Historian can actually help you with that as well. And again, no surprises here. Escobar takes the top. It was just over 23 hours. It was on the CPU for just over 23 hours during that 48-hour period, again, which is huge because I can't interact with it. Just below that is the SharkBot dropper, which was a surprising find. And T-Bot is just below that. And as before, SharkBot is pulling up the rear. Now, there are other uses of this data. I can sort by what apps are sending and transmitting data and how much data is getting sent and received. But this will also tell you what apps are using location on the phone. You can see when, how often, what frequency, and whatnot. But there is another place that you can go to see about location usage, and it's new in Android 12, and I thought it was important to talk about it here, and that's called Privacy Dashboard. Privacy Dashboard is a way, or is a tool that a user can use to see what apps are using location, camera, and microphone over a 24-hour period. And this goes for both native and third-party applications. Now, in Android 12, this is a 24-hour period. Android 13 expands that out to 7 days, which is nice because a lot of times potential victims are not going to know that there's a problem for some time. So it may take a user some time to figure out something's, phone's acting weird, or I might have spyware on my phone. This is a good place to take a look. Now, there are several nuances with this. I'm not going to go deep dive into it, but I did write about it earlier this year, so I will refer you out to my blog article about it. This is what it looks like to the user. On the left, that is the main dashboard. In the middle, that is the location dashboard for Liz's phone. You can see Samsung Helper, that's Hermit, is using my location quite a bit. And then on the right, that's from Tom's phone, McAfee. That is Escobar on Tom's phone. Now, you can see how often it's using my location. All I was doing was slipping the phones in my back pocket and just walking around my house. My house is not that big, but yet these apps are grabbing my location often. And if I were to get in the car and drive, both apps went absolutely bonkers, and I could just see the battery dropping very quickly as I'm driving along. The data for Privacy Dashboard is stored in XML, but not just any ordinary XML. It's that new Android binary XML, or ABX. Alex Caithness has a script that can parse these for you, but A-Leap will also parse Privacy Dashboard for you as well. But I've got it color coded here so you can see it. In the red, I have the app name and the APK name on the right. In the green, I have the times, and in the blue, I have what's being used. Now in the XML, you'll see op equals 1. It's an operation. Anytime camera, microphone, or location is used by the phone, it's considered to be an operation. Op equals 1 is location, op 26 equals camera, and op 27 equals microphone. Same view, but just from Tom's phone. This is, again, Escobar. And as you can see, operation, app name, and the timestamps. Now, what you see on the left from the user's point of view versus what you see in the XML file, it may be a little different. I found that the XML files tend to be a little bit more verbose. You will see more operations in there than what may be displayed to the user. So user may tell you something, you may find something extra in these XML files, and that's perfectly normal. Now, camera, location, microphone, these, in order for apps to use these things, a user has to grant permission to these apps in order to make this happen. And these particular permissions and others that are very similar to it are part of dangerous permissions. And dangerous permissions are those that Google feels can cause you as a user or the phone or both the most harm. So again, camera, location, microphone, access to your files, access to your phone, access to your messages. These are all parts of dangerous permissions. The montage on the right is Instagram. This is what happens when you run Instagram for the first time on an Android phone. It's asking you for particular permissions. It wants to access your files, access your location, your microphone, and your camera. Now, these permissions are stored in a particular file, and it's called runtime permissions, which makes sense because the phone is going to ask you for these permissions at first runtime. The thing to remember about this file is that these are the permissions that an app actually has on the phone, not the ones that are requested in the manifest file. So you may have in the manifest file, hey, it's got all these permissions. Well, you need to check this particular file to make sure that it was actually granted access to them. There can be a disconnect. This is from Liz's phone. This is the excerpt from that file for Hermit. As you can see, it has a very long list of dangerous permissions. I granted them all just to see what would happen. Now, a user can grant a permission to an app, but then change their mind. So for example, if I granted Hermit everything under the sun, and then I changed my mind later, say, you know what, I don't want you to have access to my location anymore. I can go through and turn that off. Now, it could be possible that, you know, Hermit could turn that back on or prevent me from changing that, but just know this file can help you explain behavior or explain a lack of behavior if you think you're dealing with a malicious app. A-Leap, just like before, will parse this file for you nice and neat. Again, this is from Liz's phone. This is for Hermit, and you can see all the APK name, the permission, and whether or not it's granted. If it's granted, the value will be true. If it's not granted, the value will be false. Now, I want to talk about accessibility services real quick, because accessibility services isn't necessarily a permission per se, but it's permission-ish. A user has to grant access to accessibility services in order for an app to actually use it. But when you go to do that, Android warns you, and that is a screenshot on the right. You can see, hey, do you want to let TikTok have access to all of these things? And that's because accessibility services is really powerful. It allows an app to do a whole lot of things. For those of you that may be in the IR space, this is the equivalent of getting domain admin on a domain controller. If a malicious app gets this, they've got the keys to the kingdom. It can read your screen. It can register touches on the screen. It can overlay screens on top of others. And these are things that all this malware likes to do in order to trick you into giving it valuable information. On the left, that is the accessibility services dashboard for Liz's phone. You can see Samsung Helper, that's Hermit, again, has access to it. And then you can see just above that Chrome, that's Mollybot. And you can see it says it's not working. And again, that gets back to that malfunctioning behavior that I saw from Mollybot during this exercise. Now, the good thing is an examiner can look at a particular file on Android and determine not only what apps have access to it, but also if it's even turned on. And that file is settings_secure. Now, there are two tags in this particular file that you'll need to take a look at. The first is accessibility enabled. It's very simple. The value is either going to be 0 or 1. 0 if it means it's off. 1 means you have more digging to do because something has access to accessibility services, which leads you to the second tag, and that is enabled accessibility services. Now, this tag is important because it tells you which apps have access to accessibility services. Now, if you're in a position like this where you have multiple apps that have access to it, the app names will be delineated by a colon. So here, in this case, I've got the APK name for Hermit there in the blue, and then in the green, I've got the APK name for Mollybot. This is from Tom's phone, and again, remember he had 3 apps. In the blue, you've got T-Bot, in the green, you've got Escobar, and in the purple, you have SharkBot. Now, if you've gotten to this point in your examination and you've got some apps that have access to accessibility services, and this app is checking all of these other boxes, right? It came to the phone by way of something other than the Play Store, or it's it's got a weird APK name. It's using a lot of battery, contextually speaking, or not. Just in general. And it's got a litany of dangerous permissions that don't seem to really line up with what you think the main purpose of that app may be. you should absolutely be here. At this point, you should be, okay, is likely I've got a malicious app on my hands, and you've got a couple of different ways that you can attack this from this point. You can upload it to an online sandbox and see what happens. You can hash it and upload and search against virus total. But in a situation where you're dealing with a new variant, these things may not be, something that you get a hit on. So reach out to friends and other practitioners. They may be able to help you. Now, keep in mind, you may have an app that does check all these boxes, but ends up not being malicious. And it could be just that it's poorly coded, and that could happen. But if you've gotten to this point, again, you can probably assess with a fairly good likelihood that you do have a malicious app. And if you notice, we haven't even talked about opening the app files themselves, but if you were, you would see something like this. On the left, that is Mollybot from Liz's phone, and I've got highlighted, this is a config file from the shared preps folder. I've got highlighted there bot ID and then an identifier. Okay, all right, so bot ID, that's probably not good. And then on the right, I have a config file from Sharkbot. Now, if you notice in those highlighted areas, it's keylogger : and then what looks like to be an APK name, and I've got a few highlighted: USAA, Coinbase, Credit Suisse, and Queensland Bank. These are financial apps that these are referring to. So keylogger maybe, likely so. But again, those Android artifacts coupled with what you're seeing in the specific APK folders can give you a really good way to determine, yeah, I've definitely got a malicious app on my hands. So for those of you that work in consultancy, that you can assess with high likelihood that that is the actual case. This is my contact information. If I can ever be of assistance to you, please do not hesitate to reach out. My blog site is up there. That's my Twitter handle, and I can be reached on DFIR Discord, like many people in here. If I don't respond right away, that usually means I am busy with work, life, both, right? So if you don't hear from me after a while, please just nudge me gently and I'll try to respond. If I don't know the answer, I will direct you to someone like Heather or some of the other practitioners in here that may know the answer to it. But that's all I have. With that, do we have any questions?